Hey students, we're back for week 2 of Squad Up because everyone wants a squad. We all want a community of people that care for us, helps us, and supports us. We all want a place to belong. You see, in our last video, Mitchell talked about how important it is for us to remember that when we squad up with God, we become a part of a family. And when everyone joins that family, they should find a place where they are loved and they belong. But if we're being honest about family, well, families don't always get along, like you guys know this. So as we squad up, we need to know how to fight together and how to fight for each other. So let's squad up. Family feud, friendly feud. I love a good feud, and most of the time they are friendly, right? Like Steph Curry versus LeBron James, Chick-fil-A versus Popeyes, watch our video, Notre Dame versus everyone else, right? And I know I said I love a good feud, but I don't love every feud. I like feuds about chicken sandwiches and celebrities and sports, but I hate real feuds that impact my real relationships. And I can imagine you can think of a time when you and a friend got into it over something stupid. In fact, I can think of a time when me and a couple of my closest friends were playing some Halo 3, and this was back when you all played on one TV. I know, crazy, right? And I think now they're on like Halo 10. I don't know now, or whatever. But anyway, we were just chilling, playing some video games in the basement, and I was stomping my best friend at the time. And I was just not letting up. I was rubbing it in too. I was just smashing him. And at some point, something in him just snapped. And he got so upset that he threw his controller across the room and it hit me right here in the face. Right here, side of my head. And it just chucked it at me. And before we knew it, he had a bloody nose, I had a fat lip, and my best friend was not my friend in that moment. And looking back, our fight seems less of a big deal than it did when it happened. But at the time, it felt like a great wall of division was just being built between us. And neither of us were willing to tear down that wall or to climb it. And so sometimes, I just think there are many reasons why a wall of resentment might get built up in a relationship. And whether it's a friend, a family member, or someone you hardly know, like relationships aren't always easy or happy. Like we fight, we compare, we compete. And every time we do these things, just imagine an imaginary brick being laid down between you and that person. And eventually all of these individual bricks, they grow into a wall of separation. And this wall of separation in our relationships, when we don't deal with them, they can result in a relationship that is so broken it seems impossible to put back together. And this is a problem for many of us today. We've had that friend a year ago now that we just don't even talk to anymore because the wall is too big. Something came between us and we just don't want to deal with it. This is a problem for us now, and it was a problem with the early followers of Jesus too. So we're going to pick up right where we left off last week, okay? We're in the book of the Bible called Ephesians. But first, we're going to take a quick recap though, okay? Because Paul, the author of Ephesians, he was one of the leaders of the early church. Okay, and remember, the word the church, it doesn't mean a building or an event on Sunday. It means God's family, a called out people, chosen, a community of people trying to follow Jesus. So in the early days of the church, before social media, the best way to get the word out was by letter. And so the letter we're going to look at today was Paul, is Ephesians. And it's Paul writing to a church family in the city of Ephesus. So before we dive in, you should know that the early church was made up of two groups of people. Okay, you've got the Jews and you've got the Gentiles. Jesus, by the way, was a Jew. The Jews were God's chosen people, like Israel. and the people who were used to tell God's story. And that gave us the Old Testament of the Bible, right? Like Moses and Abraham, like God's people, right? Okay, Gentile then, the Gentiles, those are a word that's a word that basically means everyone who wasn't a Jew. If you weren't a Jew back then, or if you weren't Jewish back then, you would have been called a Gentile. And before the start of the church, the Jews and the Gentiles were not people you would often find hanging out together. Okay, for generations, these two groups of people had big issues and big differences of opinion that divided them. So when Jesus arrived and declared that everyone, Jew and Gentile, was invited into God's family, some Jews and Gentiles began to come together around that message of Jesus, but then some didn't. Some didn't get along, and it just wasn't exactly easy. And Paul knew that walls of separation couldn't exist between followers of Jesus if the church was going to survive. And so in Ephesians 2, 11, 18, Paul writes about reconciliation between Jews and Gentiles and reconciliation to God. So if you haven't read that yet, pause this video and go read that. Ephesians 2, 11 through 18. Because Paul is talking about two walls here. The wall that separated the Jews and Gentiles, and then the wall that separates all of us from God. You see, this wall wasn't built by disagreements or misunderstandings. This wall between us and God was built by us and our sin, our rebellion against God. And Paul says that through Jesus, both walls can be knocked down. So in order to understand this, to fully understand what's going on, we need to talk about the wall that exists between us and between God. Because in Ephesians, Paul 2 through 10, we're going to back it up a little bit. Paul describes why this wall exists. So if you haven't read that, if you haven't read Ephesians 2, 1 through 10, pause this and go read that. Paul is talking about how we all have given into sin. But God, because of his great love for us, through Christ, has saved us. And the word saved here is referring to Jesus rescuing us from our sin and to live in eternity with God. Because sin is what we need to be saved from. It's the thing that robs us of our connection to God. Think of those imaginary bricks again. It's like every time we sin, we are putting an imaginary brick up between ourselves and God. And because of sin, every single one of us is separated from God. But Paul isn't writing this letter to convince anyone of that. Instead, he wants to talk about the plan that God had to fix it. And God did fix it. Through the death and resurrection of his son, Jesus, Jesus made a way for us to no longer be separated from God. Jesus looks at those bricks we are putting down and he smashes them. And it's because of Jesus that we have a way to be reconciled to God. And it is also because of Jesus that we have a way to be reconciled to one another. First, Paul described the way Jesus tore down the walls, right? He describes the way this wall between Jews and Gentiles, and then also this wall between us and God. And then he describes how Jesus breaks those. I think it's incredible that Jesus did this for us. But that's not the end of the story. Jesus didn't just destroy the wall between us and God. Jesus then created something new out of it. A new way for us to be close to God and a new way for Jews and Gentiles to be united under the name of Jesus. A new way for us to connect with one another. And when I think about reconciliation, I think about tables. Because when Jesus tore down the wall of separation between us and God, it's kind of like he built a table. And he invited all of us to gather and take a seat. You see, walls, they keep us separated. But tables let us see eye to eye. They let us have conversations. They let us share meals. They let us invite others to come and join us. You see, although we were separated from God and from each other, God decided to make reconciliation possible for us. Because it's through Jesus we can have peace with God and with one another. But what does our reconciliation have to do with how we get along with other people, right? How does our reconciliation with God have to do with how we reconcile with one another? Because of Jesus, we are reconciled to God. Also because of Jesus, we can reconcile with one another because we can do for others what God has done for us. You see, in the early church, there were Jews and Gentiles. Both groups had traditions surrounding how they followed God, and it was easy for them to get swept up in judging one another, disagreeing with each other, and being stubborn about their own perspective. Paul knew this. Paul knew that walls of division would keep God's family from thriving, and the same is true for us today. Just like God called the Jews and Gentiles to reconcile and to make peace with one another back then, God is calling us to reconcile and to make peace with each other today. And just like God took the first step toward us, we can take the first step towards others. Just like Jesus tore down the walls that divided us from God, we can then begin to tear down the walls that we've built between one another. Just like Jesus built a new way for us to connect with God, we can work together to rebuild relationships that were damaged. Why? Why would we do that? Because we're God's family. And as God's family, we can do for others what God has done for us. Now, don't get me wrong, it is not always easy to reconcile with that friend or with that family member, and especially with people who we disagree with. Tearing down a wall can be really difficult, and building something new can be even more challenging. But remember, we can and should do for others what God has done for us. And for some of you, that means humbling yourself. It means humbling yourself and asking for forgiveness. And for others of you, it means giving forgiveness. Because experiences like this are tangible reminders for us that what Jesus did for us doesn't just matter in eternity, it matters for our everyday lives too. That we can experience forgiveness today and we can let others experience it as well. So this week, I want to challenge you to start tearing down a wall and building a new table. Maybe the wall you need to tear down is between you and God. Listen, Jesus has already made a way for you to come to him. But maybe you need to do some work to remove some of those bricks that you've put back into place. Ask for forgiveness and then live in a way that glorifies him. Maybe the wall you need to tear down is between you and someone else. And just like Jesus made the first move of reconciliation towards us, you and me, maybe there is someone in your life who needs you to make the first move towards them. This week, how do you need to humble yourself? How do you need to ask for forgiveness? How do you need to give forgiveness? These are questions you need to be asking yourself this week. Paul had to remind the early church how important it was for them to reconcile and come together. And that message is still true for us today. The church is God's family. But if we want to act like God's family, we're going to need to tear down some walls, build some tables, and do the hard work of doing for others what God has done for us. And thanks to Jesus, we can. So let's squat up. Hey, thanks for watching this week's message. Just so you know, we are still gathering on Wednesday nights. We're still doing summer hangs, so we're outside from 6 to 8 at the pavilion, chilling, playing games, slipping down water slides, eating popsicles. Like it's a great time. So if you're looking to hang out with some friends or invite someone to the table, right? Summer hangs is a great place to do this. So come hang out with us, 6 to 8 for middle school, 6 to 9 for high school. We're chilling. We're having a good time. All right. So maybe we'll see you there. We're also going to do a little bit of small group time because we want to talk about how we can break down walls and build tables between us and God and us and one another. So guys, we hope to see you there. We miss you. We love you. Peace.